Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Tom Keating, and I'm Director of RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here in London. And it's my pleasure to have been invited by Chatham House today to moderate this webinar on coordinating the fight against financial crime. For those of you who do not know RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, we established a program in 2014 with the aim of studying issues at the intersection of finance and security, including operational and policy responses to new and existing financial crime threats and challenges, such as the subject of today's webinar. Indeed, it was with the intention of promoting the role of public-private partnership in fighting financial crime that the program at RUSI was founded. Firstly, we're delighted to be joined by Dame Sarah Thornton, who had a distinguished career with the police for over 30 years, and since 2019 has been the UK's independent anti-slavery commissioner. Secondly, Trish Sullivan is the Global Co-Head of Financial Crime Compliance at Standard Chartered Bank, a role that covers a wide range of offline and online financial crime fighting responsibilities. And thirdly, Chase Sedanius is the Global Head of Financial Crime and Industry Affairs at Refinitiv, contributor of data analysis, funding and leadership to the efforts of governments, the private sector and think tanks in advancing anti-financial crime efforts. So I'll say nothing more for now, as I'm sure they will all say more about their responsibilities and experiences in due course. So the running order is that our speakers, starting with Dame Sarah, will share initial remarks for 5 minutes before we open the floor for Q&A from our online attendees. So again, do please be sure to enter your questions online as we progress. And if you would like to see a particular question answered, do make use of the upvote function to boost it up the leaderboard, and you will know what that means when you look at the Q&A box if you don't already. So with all that said, I'm delighted now to turn the floor over, please, to Dame Sarah for her 5 minutes of opening remarks. Thank you for joining us, Dame Sarah.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to make three points in my opening remarks and then really look forward to the Q&A and the contributions of colleagues. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the scale of modern slavery and human trafficking, then talk a little bit about the importance of prevention of modern slavery and human trafficking, particularly thinking about supply chains, and then lastly about harnessing the power of the financial community, which is something that I think is really, really important. So in terms of modern slavery and human trafficking, we often say it's first and foremost an economic crime. It is about the egregious abuse of individuals who are traded and used, and it's really about profit. So it is first and foremost an economic crime. When we talk about modern slavery and human trafficking, we're using it as a kind of umbrella term. So we're talking about labor exploitation, sexual exploitation, criminal exploitation. And these are the sorts of things that, of course, they happen globally. I think a lot of people tend to think this is something that doesn't happen in this country, but I can assure you, unfortunately, it does. And I think that all of us need to think about whether we might be unwittingly being using victims of modern slavery when maybe our cars are washed, our nails are painted, or our drives are laid. So I think it's often a lot closer than we realise. In terms of the size of the kind of the problem internationally, the International Labour Organization estimates about 40 million victims, 26 million of whom are in either labour or sexual exploitation. And the cost of that is substantial. The UK government would suggest it's £4.3 billion to the UK every year. But globally, the International Labour Organization estimates about $150 billion in profits every year. So again, back to my point, it's largely an economic crime. And it's a problem that has certainly pre-exists the COVID crisis, but COVID in many ways has kind of highlighted the vulnerability of those involved, the victims and the survivors of modern slavery and human trafficking. Not only highlighted the current vulnerability, but also I think as we think about recovery now, the potential for new vulnerabilities is a very kind of real and present danger. So my second point would be about how do we prevent this? Well, the key bit of legislation in the UK is the Modern Slavery Act, in particular Section 54, which is that requirement on businesses with a turnover of more than 36 million to publish a statement every year saying what are they doing to deal with modern slavery, both in their own organisations and in their supply chains. And of course, that's important. But my observations after over a year in post would be that is just the very first step. What we're really thinking about is, what does it mean to be an ethical business where issues of people and planet are as important as profit? So of course it matters about a modern slavery statement, but that's only the kind of the first step, really. That's in the foothills. My colleague Emma Crates, who I think is listening to this call, recently did a piece of work on a substantial labour exploitation case called Operation Fort. This was a transnational organised crime group that had infiltrated labour suppliers that were supplying in Tier 1 to supermarkets and DIY stores. And in many ways, these are the most alert to the issues. And probably about 400 victims were affected over the period, and substantial issues in terms of the way they were treated and the profit that was made. But what we wanted to do was to work with the supermarkets and DIY stores to work out how could this be prevented from happening in the future? What can we learn from that really significant case to build resilience and prevention in organisations? And we developed a maturity framework which goes through kind of 4 levels, from the companies that are doing the basic stuff, which might include the modern slavery statement, to the best companies which are really thinking about what does it mean to have kind of a human rights strategy which is really concerned about people. It's concerned about what's happening in terms of their supply chains, about developing ethical competencies, and about really working and engaging with staff. Because one of the points here, I think, is it's about business caring as much about its stakeholders as it does about its shareholders. And of course, stakeholders will include employees. So to my last point, in terms of, how can we harness the power of the financial community? Couple of thoughts about that. The first is that it struck me that the issues in terms of ESG, environment, social and governance questions have become more important in the last few years. Businesses are telling me that investors are asking them many more questions about that. And of course, the investment and banking community has such a role to play in kind of making the right sort of lead, taking the right sort of lead in saying that what matters is about creating long-term value that actually helps the environment, society, and the economy, as well as just short-term return on investment. So I'm reasonably optimistic that the ESG agenda is becoming more prominent, and I think we need to do as much as we can to help that. But also in terms of the financial sector, the issue about assets, about illicit finance, and what the financial sector can be doing to deter those financial flows. And one of the things that we've recently been working on with a couple of organisations, the Tribe Freedom Foundation and the Themis Think Tank, just doing a bit of work to see about what's the level of awareness in the UK financial sector amongst employees. We published the report about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which was quite worrying reading in terms of the lack of awareness. So in that sector, 39% of senior employees believed that they were not doing enough to manage modern slavery risks in their own organisation. In fact, the same number, 39%, also thought that modern slavery didn't really occur in the UK. On the other hand, on the upside, over three quarters, 77%, believe their organisation could do a lot more to address the risks of modern slavery. So hopefully I've set out the problem. I've set out some of the things that we are trying to develop to help business, but I think there is a real opportunity for focus on the financial sector, both in terms of what it can do to encourage businesses to do the right thing, but also what it can do itself to protect and build resilience against modern slavery and human trafficking. Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you very much. Not to provide an ad break necessarily, but we actually at RUSI did a paper in 2018, which we called Leaning In, which was looking at the way the financial sector is responding to modern slavery. And it's interesting how it's completely natural. A bank would never finance a coal-fired power station nowadays. The focus on environment is very strong. perhaps not as strong on not financing a fishing fleet that could be using modern slaves in its activities. So something to talk about there in the Q&A. Trish, we'll come to you next, if we may, for the perspective from Stan Sharp, which has obviously been very active in this field over the recent years.
Thank you, Tom. I'd also like to thank Chatham House for organizing this panel and inviting me to participate. I'd like to start by picking up on a couple of points Dame Sarah made regarding finding innovative approaches to fight modern slavery and building resilience in the system. And also the point Dame Sarah made about the role the financial sector can play in this effort. So illicit finance and the impact it has on our communities is not new. The crime has been proliferating significantly, whether it be modern slavery, illegal wildlife trade, narcotics, fraud, you name it, all manner of crime is up. It affects de-risking, leading banks to take actions to de-risk certain clients, and that obviously works against the really important public policy of financial inclusion. I think what we're seeing with COVID-19 is an exacerbation of some of these issues, with fraudsters taking advantage of communities that are vulnerable, cyber security systems that are weak, and leading to a significant increase, particularly in fraud, but also in other money laundering risks. So this has led our bank, and I know other banks as well, and law enforcement, to really think about how can we be more effective in fighting financial crime, including modern slavery, which has increased as well during COVID. So we're focusing on three key areas to modernize the fight against financial crime. And first is finding the signal in the noise, using innovative technology to provide real intelligence to law enforcement. So I'll just give you an example. My bank alone processes over 800 million transactions a year that are routed through our transaction monitoring system. In order to look for red flags in that field of noise, we've had to deploy innovative technology using artificial intelligence so that our teams can really focus on key red flag risks related to human trafficking and not waste time on false positives. So we are encouraging innovative technology. FATF and many key regulators around the world have come out in support of promoting innovative technology for a risk-based approach. The second area we're focusing on is building financial information sharing partnerships so that banks can work together to share intelligence, law enforcement can work with banks to share intelligence, and banks can share intelligence back to law enforcement. This is really key to effectively addressing modern slavery risks in particular, which are a bit more difficult to identify as one bank if you're just looking at red flags. We need to work with law enforcement to understand the modern slavery bread actors and put that information together with what we're seeing at our bank and what other banks are seeing, and build the puzzle and present a coherent picture to law enforcement to take action. During COVID-19, we also worked with the Ppp Model to try and tackle COVID fraud. We organized a session in the US and the UK to bring the private and public sector together to share red flags and be more effective in fighting COVID fraud. It's absolutely true for modern slavery, and there are real life examples where by building FISPs, we can actually take down some organized criminal gangs that are exploiting vulnerable people. The third area we're focusing on to really be more effective in fighting financial crime relates to how we educate our own teams, but also our clients. So for modern slavery in particular, we've rolled out extensive red flag training in our bank so that teams, whether they're doing trade finance, processing, AML monitoring, they know which red flags to escalate. We've also rolled out this training to our financial institution clients as well as some of our clients in the development organization sector. We do this through normally in-person academies that we organize on the ground in our network, which is 60 countries across the globe. But during COVID-19, we've actually held 3 virtual academies to bring our clients together to share red flags and best practices to fight financial crime. So for us, it's about risk-based approach to controls using innovative technology, sharing information across the public and private sector, and then finally educating our clients and our teams on red flags. And I think if you bring these three things together, you'll be more effective. This is endorsed by the Wolfsburg Group, who put out a statement on effectiveness and is very much aligned with FATF and the recent European Banking Federation AML action plan. Thanks, Tom.
Great, Trish, thank you very much. A couple of questions spring to mind, but I will save those until after we've heard from Jay. I'll pass the floor to you, sir.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Chatham House, for the invitation on such an important topic, and also congratulate Chatham House on, I believe it's 100th year anniversary this year. So congratulations as well. And as a company, Refinitiv as a new entity is fairly new, but certainly we are a company that's been around, in fact, since the 1850s, in fact. On providing data to the market. Now, the data during those days was providing stock prices between Aachen, Germany, and Brussels, and the mechanism for distributing that data were carrier pigeons. So we have certainly come a long way as a company, and this is a bit of context. So we supply risk intelligence data not only to banks but also corporates, financial intelligence units, and law enforcement across the world. We're in about 240 countries, and in overall about 18,000 strong. So we consider ourselves a global company, but with a local expertise and local knowledge. So to set the scene on the coordinating the fight against financial crime, I guess I'd like to make two points. The first is what we're doing to make sure that we can provide the best data that organizations need. And what I mean by data, it's not just names for screening purposes, but also being able to unlock the very complex web of business relationships in order to unearth and really untangle that level of complexity. As was mentioned by Dame and Trish, financial crime is global by its very nature. So it's really about what we can do to provide that global picture in the best way that we can. But also the other piece, beyond the data piece, beyond the technology piece, is something that Tom alluded to, which we think is equally, if not even more important. And that really is how we can much more effectively work together across the public and private sector. Now, the PPP model is usually in reference to kind of an operating model akin to the Joint Monitoring Task Force and many of those types of initiatives that have now sprung up really in the last few years in many different jurisdictions. But it's also really around how we can harness each other's expertise to really, A, make informed policy decisions, B, share the best in class in terms of what works, with the overall aim of increasing effectiveness, which is the key operative word here. We've been at this now for 30 years, since, if you use the Financial License Task Force as a leverage, or at least a starting point, but yet it's estimated that less than 1% of money laundering is actually caught or seized by law enforcement. And I think that's the context in which there's so much support more broadly to really increase information sharing, which of course, particularly from a European context, but also in other jurisdictions, really gets into, what level of cooperation can we actually achieve to make sure that we also meet other regulatory reform and requirements such as data privacy, which I'm not going to get into in great detail. But the other piece that we're very committed to on the concept of public-private partnerships is engaging with policymakers, and we've done this through various forms. The first is formed together with World United Service Institutes, World Economic Forum, and Europol, many other important actors in this field, is we formed a global coalition to fight financial crime. And that was really a vehicle for both NGOs, the banking community, law enforcement, to really come together to kind of share what we're seeing in the market, share our best practices and insights, with the overall objective of informing policymakers for them to make evidence-based decisions in how the world actually works. And you know, we're pleased that so many of policymakers have been very open to this, and so we've engaged not only the UK government but the European Commission with its EU AML action plan that was referenced by Trish. And if you read through that action plan, it's very much a positive reflection, in our view, in my view, of some of the initiatives that the members of the coalition have been engaging with. So whether it's encouraging public-private partnerships that was discussed, whether it's a proper application of data privacy, whether it's looking at public registers, and many other aspects that we think are absolutely key to unlocking the inefficiencies in the current system. But beyond that, we're also part of the EU AML task force. We're also part of a World Economic Forum initiative on beneficial ownerships, and running a pilot program in terms of what some of those how they work, how that information actually is verified, because we know ourselves as a global company, and we use public registries ourselves as a function of the data that we provide, that less than half of the ones that we surveyed, and I'm talking about 200 registries globally, that half of them have any information on directorships, and less than half have any information on shareholders. So there's some work for us to do there. We're no strangers to being big supporters of the future of financial intelligence sharing program. We continue to. And then on the specific issues and how we more directly can use our data really to make an informed decision on how crime works in terms of where do the criminals operate, which jurisdictions are they connected to. So we did a piece of work in preparation for the annual meeting last year on human trafficking. And this is again from the perpetrator's perspective, not from the victim's perspective. Which jurisdictions do they operate in to and fro? And as was alluded to by Dame, if you have an operation or relationship in Romania and you're a UK firm, then it's quite possible that you have human trafficking as part of your risk in your supply chain. It was also alluded to, which we fully agree with, about the nature of the environmental and social and governance theme, and how that's impacting and relating to financial crime. And I'll spend just a moment to talk about that, because I think that's an important point to make. The first is that we see an increased convergence between the sustainability issues, which is very much about ethical investment for the future, and very much about the peace and security that financial crime and what we call green crime causes right now. Now, we did a session on this topic in Davos again earlier this year, and needless to say, we had no idea at that moment of the global impact of COVID-19, but that has put this topic on its head. And so, that is one area that we really think needs to be, greater focus and policy priorities. And we're incredibly encouraged that FATF last week really, has doubled down on wildlife trafficking. We've also seen from the Germans that they very much look at environmental issues. So that is something that we are very much dedicated, again, to make informed decisions around how we can best support that effort. And again, as part of what we can do in using our data, we also commissioned a piece of work to look at the top 3 jurisdictions globally that are most affected, again, from the perpetrator's perspective. And so we did a piece of work around that in terms of really showing where some of these activities actually occur and the jurisdictions that are most impacted by them. And the last, I'll also say as a way of adding some statistics around this. So we actually ran a webinar last week, in fact, where we asked the participants. We had over 1,800 registered in that event, and we asked them, do you think that green crime, as we call it, which is wildlife trafficking, environmental crime, and a threat to biodiversity and other issues, do you actually think that it's a threat to peace and security? And 81% said yes. Surprisingly, I did not expect it. 84% agreed that, in fact, ecocide should be added to the list of international crimes by the International Criminal Court. and 84% thought that, again, green crime, if you adopt that theme, should receive equal attention as money laundering and terrorism financing should. So this is really on the back of some of the points that were made before, that the intersection between environmental issues and financial crime issues are going to converge in very near future. So I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions, and thanks again for the invitation.
Jay, thank you very much. Just a reminder to our attendees, do tap away on your keyboards and send us any questions you want to have answered. But Sarah, if I may come to you first with a question. Obviously, you came into the role you're currently in, as you said, just over a year ago. I'm wondering whether you could perhaps characterize for us what you found when you arrived in terms of the nature of the partnership that existed between the financial sector and the law enforcement world and others who were trying to tackle modern slavery and human trafficking. What did you expect to find, and how was it when you lifted the lid and had a look?
So I think that it was probably what I expected to find, because I had a background in law enforcement, and I know that in a whole range of areas across financial crime, that there has been a desire, certainly from government, to do an awful lot more with the private sector and to see the kind of the responsibility as co-owned and the kind of opportunities for collaboration and co-production. But that very often there's the strategy or the desire to do it, but it's actually how do you make it happen on the ground? So I think the points that Patricia made, I would completely agree with, the importance of the red flags, the importance of sharing intelligence, and of course about raising awareness. But what has struck me about sharing intelligence and sharing data over a year in, that everybody talks about it, but there seems to be quite profound barriers, and maybe quite understandable barriers. Somebody mentioned privacy, to actually doing it. So we all hold different pieces of the jigsaw, whether that's law enforcement, whether that's the banks, whether that's business, whether it's NGOs. But actually I could reel off a list of the different initiatives I'm aware of, which are about data sharing. And I just know it's actually very complicated to get it happening on the ground. So my sense would be there's a lot of good aspiration and ambition and some kind of strategy and planning, but actually it's a delivery challenge, I think, that we've got.
Great. I'll come to the others in a second, because I know they'll both have views on that. But I just wanted, while you've got the microphone, as it were, just to zoom out a bit. Obviously, the Slavery Act, the Modern Slavery Act, and the whole leadership that the UK has shown with regards to modern slavery around the world was very much a passion of Theresa May as Home Secretary, and then obviously followed her to number 10. How can you assure us that the UK's commitment to modern slavery on the international stage will continue? Because obviously we have a changing of the guard.
So I think that Theresa May was an outstanding leader in this sector for us, as you say, both as Home Secretary and Prime Minister. And probably that's the unusual. That's not the usual. That's not what normally happens. And it was great that she did that. In terms of, you asked me specifically, how do I assure you of the government's commitment? It's not my job to assure you, because I'm an independent anti-slavery commissioner. So I sit in government and say, okay, what is your commitment? So it's my job to kind of hold to account, to look for good practice, to kind of say, that, for example, post-Brexit, all the work that's been done on trade agreements, in those agreements, to what extent are issues about protection for workers in whatever part of the world they're in? Where do we think that kind of human rights consideration should figure in that? That's the sort of prompt. If we think about the new immigration approach and the immigration bills going through Parliament at the moment, to what extent does that have the protection of the vulnerable, the potential victims of trafficking at its centre? So it's not my job to assure, it's my job to kind of to challenge and to say this really matters. I would say, just kind of in one final thought, I had a really constructive meeting with Lord Ahmed, who's a Foreign Office DFID minister, 3 or 4 weeks ago. And certainly from his perspective and issues of supply chain and working internationally, there was tremendous commitment. He gets it, and he is passionate about trying to do something and continue to take that flag forward.
Great. Thank you for the correction. Yes, very important. You are indeed the independent anti-slavery commissioner, and I'm sure you will wield that independence on behalf of us all. Trish, if I could come to you then. Sarah referred to the barriers and so on. Obviously, Stanchart, you've been central to the development of many of the PPPs, public-private partnerships around the world, and certainly led the human trafficking and organised immigration crime GIMLIT working group from the start. So what barriers do you see to contributing fully to tackling the illicit finance related to human trafficking, and how do we try and fix those?
It's a very real barrier. So the public-private partnership that was built in the U.S. over the past several years really was enabled in its success because the U.S. under the Patriot Act has the 314B provision, which allows for that bank-to-bank sharing of information. And similar in the UK, the GIMLIT has had a good deal of success in actually, helping law enforcement with arrests and prosecutions because mechanisms were put in place that gave that legal basis for bank-to-bank sharing of information. Following on from that success, we have seen more jurisdictions come out with some legal support for bank-to-bank sharing of information, but it's few and far between. And this is an area where we really have to do better. I was really encouraged by FATF's paper last week on illegal wildlife trade, where they specifically noted the value of information sharing in effectively tackling illegal wildlife trade. And the very same holds true for anti-human trafficking. And we need that FATF objective to be drilled down into legal frameworks where there are priorities that can overcome the very real concern for reaching data sharing and privacy of individuals. It's a growing tension, privacy versus supporting law enforcement and globalization of law enforcement efforts. But I think with targeted priorities that are shared, we can come to frameworks where data can be shared in a confidential and secure way. And actually, there are some really great technology vendors now working with governments to put in place systems that can allow a safer sharing of information that maintains some privacy, but still shares the core aspects of the data that will assist law enforcement. So there's a technology solution here, as well as legal frameworks that are needed to allow banks to share information. We have a long way to go, but it is helpful to have some real examples out of certain countries where it's a working model that's successful.
So given the kind of footprint that Stanchart has, obviously Che and others have mentioned the UK's Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force, the public-private partnership in the UK, which has a dedicated focus on human trafficking and organised immigration crime. Where else do you see bright spots in the public-private partnerships around the world, specifically on anti-human trafficking?
Mm-hmm. Specifically on anti-human trafficking, that's a bit of a tough one. We have seen bright spots of public-private partnership, particularly for illegal wildlife trade, but also at a more generic level. The UAE and South Africa are doing really good work in this space. I wouldn't say their focus is specifically on human trafficking, but once you put the frameworks in place to share information, it can be used for any law enforcement priority. Human trafficking has been found to be a good place to start because generally it's a shared objective of many different groups to tackle human trafficking. Sometimes it's not always as easy to find those shared objectives in other predicate offenses. So I see bright spots in the UAE, South Africa, Germany as well, but I can't say they're specifically focused on human trafficking.
Thank you. You've made the point that I was hoping you would make, which is that I think we have a long way to go in turning the talk into reality. I think that's a good point. Che, if I could turn to you, I am going to allow you to talk about data protection, which I know is one of your favorite topics. Without using up all the time we have left, where do you see the major data sharing issues? Is it fair to say that in trying to tackle any form of financial crime, but human trafficking notably because it's a cross-border crime, we're our own worst enemy, are we not?
So thanks for that, Tom. And as Tom all too well know, I've been speaking about the data privacy for way too long, and I was hoping others could pick up the baton on this issue. But to be very specific, and again, this is part of our ongoing engagement with some of the data privacy officers, and I think there's two aspects, at least two aspects here. One relates to the previous comments around what focuses on human trafficking or other issues. And we're in a bit in a conceptual trap because crime and criminal organizations and illicit activity are all interconnected. So human trafficking is connected to drugs trafficking, it's connected to environmental trafficking. So, and that is one area that we're trying to move away from. I know that we're all living under predicate offenses, but that ends up being a conceptual trap in the sense that the criminal organizations are linked, and so we have to look at it on fighting financial crime versus fighting human trafficking, because if you fight one, you fight the other. And how that relates to data privacy is the concept of public interest. Now, in the public interest within GDPR specifically, provide some provisions around, if there's something that you need to do to prevent state security or national security, that there are some provisions around that. But the definition of public interest is quite narrow, number one. And a lot of organizations outside of banks, like corporates, are trying to meet a multitude of regulatory regimes that doesn't necessarily fit within the 21 predicate offenses necessarily, but they have to meet some requirement in Australia or South Africa that may be very distinct in those jurisdictions. The second issue is the lack of extraterritorial application, meaning that as long as you're meeting data privacy, as long as you're doing something to meet a regulatory requirement within a member state, within the EU in this case, then you have some leeway in terms of allowing you to do that. But it doesn't recognize other regulatory requirements in other jurisdictions. So the issue comes to a head when a bank who relies on the dollar funding market, which most do, and they're processing data on a particular predicate offense or a US sanctions list that doesn't necessarily equate to the EU, then the question is, which regulatory regime do you decide to be non-conformant with? Now, in the US sanctions example, that could be quite harmful if the US Treasury deems that you, in fact, have violated US sanctions and take enforcement action against you. Or you have to make the case to data privacy officers that you had to do this to do this. So those are just very quick examples. But I am very optimistic, in fact, because already in the EU action plan is the first time that I've ever seen a recognition that there's a tension between the two. Now, the way it's worded, and I'll try not to take too much of this time here, but it's quite narrow because it only refers to public-private partnerships. There needs to be a much more broader expansion of allowing organizations outside of the PPP framework to do that, but it's the first time that there's movement here, and so I'm quite hopeful, and as well I'm hopeful on PPPs overall. I mean, in a number of different European jurisdictions, as an example, outside of Hong Kong and Singapore and London, Germany, Sweden, Austria, Switzerland. I mean, it's a case of let a thousand flowers bloom. So I'm quite optimistic about the future. The question is a cross-border, which is the other issue that we need to tackle.
Yes. The importance of partnership would seem to be self-evident, but as you say, it's taking a while for that to catch on. Unfortunately, we have to finish at 1:45, so I'm just going to go around everybody and ask sort of one final question to each of you on a similar theme. But so, Sarah, if I may start with you. Again, we've been talking about coordination and financial crime as relates to modern slavery. What are the one or two things that you would like to see the financial sector do now, having had an opportunity to sort of take a 12-month or so look at the landscape in the UK and indeed internationally? What are the one or two things you would like to see the financial sector do to contribute to the effort that you're part of?
It's one of the points that I made earlier. I think it's so important in terms of the role of the financial sector, banks, in terms of investment and the leverage that can be had through that, in terms of saying, you know, the whole issue, of course, it's about the environment and climate, but it is also about the social issues, about the people issues, and that sort of thing is kind of rewarded. And those are the tough questions that investors are asking of businesses when they seek to put money in them. I think that's a key one. The second, I think, notwithstanding my concern about the slow pace of change in terms of data sharing, information sharing, we do need to find ways around it. I'm very pleased to hear Shay's optimistic, despite the complexity of it. But I would hope over the next couple of years that we could make some sort of breakthrough, because it's clear that we won't really make our kind of institutions resilient and protect them against illicit financial flows unless we can work much more together.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, I'm encouraged when I read people like, his name escapes me, but the CEO of the Children's Investment Fund, which is a pretty active or vigorous investor based in London, focusing more and more on ESG as an investment criteria. Certainly, Trish, I'll come to you with a sort of same question, but the other way around. What would you like to see happen more from domestic policymakers? And internationally as well, but maybe focus on the UK to make it kind of easier for you to contribute to the fight against the criminal finances of human trafficking.
Sure. So it's a great question. Right now, the criminals are absolutely winning in the war on crime. The impact on people, on our communities, on our environment, on the economy is very real. We need to reform, and it's not just one side on law enforcement or on the financial sector. So my ask from the public sector is greater sharing of actionable intelligence and greater sharing of top law enforcement priorities, so that the financial sector could then align their controls accordingly. As you're aware, financial institutions invest a great deal in building strong financial crime compliance programs and hire many individuals that are really passionate about fighting financial crime. If we can work together on the shared law enforcement priorities and create a framework so that law enforcement can share with us their top illicit actors that they're working on, what data points they have, we can come together and really create a strong law enforcement case that could actually lead to arrests and prosecutions. So shared priorities on top criminal risks and actionable intelligence would be my top two asks.
Great, thank you very much. And Che, you know what the question is going to be, your perspectives, and the answer can't be easier data sharing.
No, there's 3 points I'd like to make. The first is increased cooperation. Now, I'm not anchoring that statement in information sharing, but it's a much broader point than that. What I mean there is that there's a role here for the G20. There's a role here for the B20. There's a role here for Financial Action Task Force, really to bring together a much greater degree of stakeholders here, because it ends up being, regulators and banks. When there are customs unions, that needs to be part of the conversations. There's, of course, law enforcement. There's a whole variety of key stakeholders who all have a stake in this. And as I mentioned at my opening remarks, the Global Coalition is just one example of that, where we can kind of bring together each other in a neutral format, if you will, and be very honest about what we think we should do. So that's just one example. In the UK's case, that also means being much more proactive in its international forum in pushing for its agenda, whether that's human trafficking or other issues that are so important. And I mentioned human trafficking specifically because while the UK is not necessarily the top 5 countries or jurisdictions, it is the top, one of the top countries in terms of the financial transactions that's financing this activity. So if the UK is interested in maintaining and protecting the financial integrity of its banking system, this is an area that I think needs to be looked at. And then the last one is more legal certainty. In the US, 314A and 314B are pretty clear, but clearly, there's a lot of other jurisdictions that need more legal certainty to allow for more information sharing, not just between the public and the private sector, but between the private sector with each other. So what we're doing is we're trying to get there in terms of engaging with policymakers in the most constructive way. We've started that piece of work. We will continue to do so. And I think if you raise awareness and we try to look at financial crime not as a compliance issue, but this cuts to the heart of protecting the integrity of a banking system, raising awareness of the devastating human aspect to this, which human trafficking is just one of those. So if you put it in those terms, and the conversation changes very quickly. And I think that the AML action plan, and I encourage those who haven't read it to look at it, because that plan is, not only is it ambitious, incredibly ambitious, but it's also a reflection of the fact that these issues are taken very, very seriously at the highest level. Thank you.
Che, thank you. Good to end with us suggesting we look to the EU for leadership. So thank you all very much for joining us. I mean, I think the 2 main things I would take away from this is we've been talking about partnership and information sharing for quite a while now. And indeed, we have had partnerships and information sharing to one degree or another. But it really, I think we can all agree it's time to take it to the next level and do it for real, not just for show, or at least press forward. And then I think the other thing is that this is an area where the UK has shown leadership in recent years, and in the context of global Britain and everything else, it would be great to see, for lots of reasons, that the UK continue to dominate leadership in this space. So more power to the oversight and the questions asked by Dame Sarah of the new government. So thank you very much to Dame Sarah, to Trish, and to Che for contributions. Thank you to all of you for joining us online, and thank you, of course, to the Chatham House events team for inviting us all today, bringing us together and being the technical masterminds behind the scenes. So until next time, as said, I've been Tom Keating. Stay well, all of you, and have a good day wherever you are. Bye for now.